that I always say to people, it's kind of like that old you know, real estate adage. They say, you know, what's the most important thing for real estate? And then the agent says, you know, location, location, location. And so what I say in charities and not-for-profits and in this space, it's partnership, partnership, partnership. And that's really, really important. And that's what I'm going to be talking about is working with partners. So, you know, there's been some pretty important changes that have happened in 2022. And I'm going to try to explain those, some of the big ones to you. We had a federal budget that came down in April and brought these big changes. And you know what happens with government and the way law works is that it has to be implemented and there has to be regulations. And so you know, we're finally at a stage right now in March where we're getting more guidance from the Canadian government about these changes. So the first change that I'm going to be talking about is what's called the new qualifying disbursements. And so, you know, you're starting to fall asleep right now and you're kind of wondering, you know, what is this guy talking about and why is this important to me and to my organization? And so the question is, you know, does your organization work with partners? Does your organization send, you know, money or medical supplies or let's say, you know, clothing or something like that overseas, over to Ukraine, over to Egypt, over to Sri Lanka? We have different, you know, different. It's not just the Ukrainian community here tonight. We have other representatives, and so any organization that that works with partners overseas, this is for you. This is important. So, you know, I'm going to sort of jump ahead to a visual slide here. And this is going to help us all to understand, you know, how the, you know, how charities are able to work with, you know, with their assets, with their volunteers and that sort of thing. So, there's two ways that that a charity can give out its funds, and the first way is that it can give a grant, it can give a gift to another Canadian charity. We call that a qualified donee. Okay, so a qualified donee is not just a registered charity. A qualified donee can also be a Canadian municipality. A qualified donee can be an athletic association. It can be a Canadian university, and also what we would call a recognized foreign university. So these can be few and far between. In Ukraine, there's actually one recognized foreign university that is recognized by the Canada Revenue Agency, and that is the Kiev-Mohyla Academy. And that was just recently recognized in November of 2022. Many of you haven't heard about it yet because they're going to be, you know, spreading out the announcement. But for people who are interested, for instance, in education in Ukraine, then that's one way that you can help. You can donate directly to that Canadian, so that Ukrainian university, a foreign university, and you will be able to get a tax receipt, which will be valid for your Canadian taxes. So that's one way that the Canadian government supports initiatives overseas. So that's the first thing, is that you can give a gift to a qualified donee. The other way that you can do your work is either through your own volunteers. And everyone you know, here in this room is probably doing that sort of thing. So you do the work through your own volunteers, or the second way is that you have what's called an intermediary. And that's where, you know, a lot of the organizations here who do work in Ukraine will be selecting a partner overseas, a partner in Ukraine. Now, the way that it used to work up until January 2023 is the only way that you could do work with a foreign non-qualified donee is if you had direction and control over the project. So you had to have full direction and control. And this is sometimes can be quite difficult because you might have an organization, a not-for-profit or a Ukrainian charity, which has a great program, but you didn't start it. The Canadian organization didn't start it. And so then how can you have direction and control over a project that's really going well? Let's say it could be a medical clinic in Ukraine, or a hospital or something like that, but how can you have direction and control over that? So there was a type of, you know, what we would call a legal fiction that was created. But what I always would advise clients, advise people to do is to say, make a Canadian component of that project over in Ukraine. So let's say if it's a school, then you're going to build a playground. You're going to finance building a playground. So you can't, let's say, finance or support the whole school, but you're going to carve out a specific area and make a Canadian project. Now there's a new layer that has come on. And so this new layer actually is supposed to make things administratively easier for charities, but there's still going to be some work that you have to do. So this new layer is called grants to a non-qualified donee, and this is where you can really work with your partner. So you can still work in the old way, where you can have a direction and control over a specific program. So if you have a program that you started and that's running, you can still do that. You can still keep that going. If you want to have a program overseas in Ukraine or in another country, which you feel, you know what, we want to have that direction and control, you can still do it that way. But if you want to make more of a you know, peer-to-peer partnership type of arrangement, then you can have this kind of arrangement, which is called making a grant to a non-qualified donee. So I'm going to go into a little bit of some of the factors. Okay, so these are what the Canadian government has recently set out. They've set out a guidance, and it's just come out. It came out at the end of November. They were looking for input, and the period for input ended at the end of January. And so now this is, although it's not finalized, this is still a little bit of a work in progress. But these are what are called the accountability tools. So if you're going to have a partnership with a non-qualified donee, then you need to do some due diligence, and you need to use these what they call accountability tools. So you have to conduct a due diligence review. So, you know, what does that mean? So doing due diligence is going to be, it's like getting to know your partner, getting to know, you know, who are the directors over there. You're going to want to see their what we call constating documents, their articles of incorporation. If they're going to be in Ukrainian, or if you're working in another country, they'll be in another language. So you'll want to get those translated into English. It doesn't have to be by a certified translator, but you'll want to get a good translation of those documents so that you can show the Canadian authorities that you've been doing your due diligence, that you've been getting to know your partner. Continuing on in terms of the type of things that you need for this partnership agreement or arrangement, you'll want a description of the grant activity. Now, we're going to get into a little bit later about high risk, medium risk, and low risk, and how to define that. If the project is high risk, then you're going to need a much more detailed description of the activity. If it's low risk, then you can have more of a bullet point sort of description. A written agreement is always recommended, and again, when it's high risk, well, that's you're going to need to have a much more comprehensive agreement. If it's low risk, then you can have maybe something what we would call a letter of intent, or like a memo with bullet points, which sort of sets out the key objectives of your partnership. Then the next accountability tool is monitoring and reporting. So, of course, if you're sending money overseas, you want to have reports back, and you want to have. So the details of the report is going to vary according to whether it's high risk or low risk, and also the frequency is going to vary. So, of course, you want to report at the end of the project. But you might want to have, because it's a higher risk, it might be advisable to have interim reports. You don't want to be sending, $50,000, $250,000 overseas and then just sort of letting it, hoping that your money is going to be spent well. So that's why you want to have a transfer schedule. You want to send money in tranches or slices so that, and you have to sort of determine, well, what's best for the project? Can we send 10,000 at a time, or can we send 25,000? Some projects might need, 50,000 at a time because they're doing, certain work, and they might say to you, we need to have, if you have a $250,000 project, we need 50,000 at a time. So you have to sort of gauge the risk, and how well do you know your partner. In all cases, you need to have, sorry, and I haven't advanced the slide. I'm advancing it on my, so my apologies. In all cases, you want to have separately tracked funds. So that means that you want to keep your money, the Canadian money, separate from money that's overseas. So it's always best for them, for your partner, to open up a separate bank account so that the funds are not commingled and that they can be easily accounted for. So, they should have an accountant and send you, or a bookkeeper who's going to send you a report. And then you're going to need to include that in your financial statements. So I want to sort of move ahead to, I've been talking to you about risk. And so this slide is going to talk a little bit about what we call the risk matrix. And so this is all necessary when you're evaluating your partner, your overseas partner. So there's risk that the CRA, that the Charities Directorate is going to look at from the perspective of the Canadian organization and the overseas organization. So if the charity, and the charity means the Canadian organization, if the charity has, no experience with overseas projects, then the risk is high. If the charity has more experience, then the risk is lower. And then the same thing for the grantee's experience, and that's the organization overseas. If the grantee has, a lot of experience, if they're an established partner, if they've been doing something in Ukraine already for 5 years, then that's the kind of partner, or 10 years, that's the kind of partner that you want to associate with. And of course, sometimes in this context, in the context of the war in Ukraine, there are, as has been mentioned, a lot of groups that have sort of sprung up, so to speak, in the past year. So if that's the case, if you're dealing with an organization that is new, then you want to have, tighter controls. Even though you're not in this so-called direction and control regime, you still want to have, control over the what they're doing with the money and how it's being used. So grant activity location, that's a risk factor. So, they say if it's outside of Canada, it's higher risk. Okay, if it's in a region where there's instability, it's higher risk. So it sounds to me like, if your organization in Canada is doing work in Ukraine, which is in a conflict zone, you're in the highest of risk. So that's where you want to make sure that you're exercising enough control. Even we've seen, I've been dealing with, let's say, an organization that has projects in Egypt, and the Canadian government was looking at these projects as being high risk, and that was quite a surprise to the Canadian organization. Well, they were Egyptian, they spoke Arabic, and so how come the Canadian government looks at that as high risk? And is it just because they're Egyptian? Is it because they're Arabic? And I have Ukrainian clients who say the same thing. Is it because we're no, it's not because you're from a specific group. It's because the people in the Charities Directorate take a very cautious approach. You have to sort of understand as well the people who are behind the desks. They have an auditing background, and so they're very cautious. So sometimes what we have to do is we have to give them as much information as we think is necessary and as they want. But then at a certain point in time, yes, we'll push back at them and we'll say, you have enough information. Everything that we've provided is good enough for you to make. And this is in the case if you're applying for charitable registration. So again, some risk factors are the amount of the grant, and it's surprising because it's quite a low amount. $25,000 is over $25,000 is considered high risk. And I'm just trying to think of, like, if you're putting together money to raise for sending or procuring an ambulance, you might be able to get it under $25,000, but likely over. But so between 5 and 25, that's medium risk. Over 25, it's high risk. You're in Ukraine, it's high risk. So just doing something like medical supplies over to Ukraine, even though medical supplies is in and of itself is actually low risk, because medical supplies are just supposed to be used for that purpose, but supplies can be sold and turned into cash. And so that's another reason why you have to know your partners. That's another reason why you have to have control over who you're dealing with. So I want to assure you that everyone who's been registered is going to be getting a copy of these slides. There's a lot of information in there, and you can go over that. I understand that this is kind of a summary, but you'll be able to go over that, and and then if you have questions afterwards, by all means, you can contact me, you can contact others who are involved in this area, but also you can call the Charities Directorate themselves. They have a very good helpline. I'm going to give you a tip right now, is that if you're not satisfied with the answer that you're getting at sort of the first level when you speak with somebody at the on the helpline, you can ask to speak with a senior analyst, and then you'll be able to speak with somebody who has even more experience and can give you more in-depth answers, and will be able to provide you with they have written guidance. Yes, there's a lot of information to wade through, but they are trying to be, at the Charities Directorate, they are trying to be more and more helpful. So take advantage of that free resource, and as we're talking about tonight, I mean, knowledge, the more you educate yourself and the more you use those free resources, the more it's going to help you in your organization. I'm over my time, but just a few words about the new disbursement quotas. These new disbursement quotas came into effect as of January the 1st of this year, and so sort of the biggest, I'm going to give you one example which will sort of summarize it, and then I will tell you another pro tip. So when you're calculating what's called the disbursement quotas, you're looking at the unused property of the charity. So if you have up to $1 million in unused property, which could be a building, which could be an investment, then that's going to count towards your disbursement quota at the rate of 3.5%. Anything over $1 million, then that's where the increase has come about. It's going to be 5%. So what that means is that you have to actually use that amount of money, so $35,000 plus any 5% of any excess. You have to use that in that particular year. The other big change, and this is something that we're still trying to get our heads around in the charity space, how it's going to affect organizations, is that charities can no longer accumulate property for a particular purpose, so that income earned from the property is not counted in the DQ calculation. So I know that's even sort of above and over my pay grade, and so that's where the pro tip comes in, is you need to speak with your accountant. You need to speak with an accountant who is familiar with charities, and not just the accountant who is doing your taxes, because it's important to go to a specialist. So those are the two major changes that have come across in 2022. The big game changer in terms of the people in this audience is the ability to work with partners and not to have direction and control over the project, but that you can work as a true partner with that project, but still maintain a certain degree of control, look at the risk, and assess that. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Taras, and good night to everyone. I have two questions for you. First of all, really phenomenal. I'm really happy to hear about those 3 points and looking to dig a little further into that. So like many of us in here, I'm also from another country and operating charities in Barbados and here in Canada. And so I wanted to know, for what you described, one, how would creating chapters in the two different countries that are associated with the same charity help in that process? And two, after you've come to the agreement with the partner, where does this process fit in? Do you need the Charities Directorate to approve the grant before it can be disbursed, or is this after the grant has been disbursed and you're justifying using local donor dollars that have received tax receipts for this external purpose? So just a process question. Thanks.
Is it okay? Thank you so much. I appreciate that the question. So there's two questions, and I'm going to try to remember and answer. And first question is about creating chapters, but not necessarily creating chapters in Canada, but creating overseas chapters. Yeah. Okay. So what you have to do is you know, and the basic guideline for anything that you do is comply with local laws. Okay. So you have to comply with the Canadian laws, and you have to make sure that your organization is recognized. Either it has a provincial incorporation or provincial existence or a federal existence. All charities start off as not-for-profits, but not all not-for-profits are charities, and you have to get registration. So if you're going to do that, then you would seek registration as a Canadian charity. Now, the organization that's operating, whether it be in Barbados or in Ukraine, it needs to have recognition according to the local laws. You could work with volunteers from Canada that go over to Barbados or Ukraine, and that's totally permissible. But if you want to have some kind of recognition, let's say in Ukraine or in Barbados, then you want to comply with local laws and incorporate or set it up according to the local jurisdiction there. So that's the first, my answer to the first question. And then the second question is this process, and I think that that's I appreciate that question, the process, and do you have to get CRA's approval for if you're working with a partner? Okay, so there's two answers. One is yes, and one is no. And so yes is if you're in the process of applying for charitable registration, because then the Charities Directorate is going to really look at everything, and they're going to look at what you're doing, what you propose to do. They're going to want to see the agreements, and yes, they're going to look over those agreements and documents with a fine-tooth comb. And so in that sense, they're not necessarily approving, you know, the actual arrangement, but they're looking at the arrangement in order to approve your charity application. Okay? So then the no part is that if you're a not-for-profit or if you're a charity and you decide that you're going to seek and make a partnership with another organization, you don't have to go and get that approved by the Charities Directorate. But you have to remember that you could always get audited. And so if you get audited, then you need to have all the backup. You need to have your books and records. You need to have your books and records in Canada, but you also need to make sure that your partner has books and records available so that if you get audited, they will be able to provide you with everything. So I think that's the answer. It's yes and no.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
I learned a lot. So my name is Carmen. Just like our friend, I don't have a Ukrainian background. I'm looking to crowdfund a project in the platform of like Kickstarter, the same way they crowdfund like startups or Indiegogo. So I'm registered in Canada, but those crowdfunds are based in California, and they work better with US companies and organizations. So if I want to register my organization in US and basically crowdfunding with like Kickstarter or Indiegogo or US basically companies, crowdfunding companies, does that apply? Does the things that you discussed from Canada's point of view, does that apply to me, or I should basically look at what U.S. government looks for charities and whatnot.
Okay, so no, thank you. That's, I mean, we're in such an international world right now where things are, you know, cross-border and sources of funding, you know, there might be easier access to sources of funding in the United States. And so if you are going to be raising funds in the United States and you can't give a Canadian charity receipt. If you have a Canadian charity, you can't give it to American donors, and likewise Canadian donors, if they donate to an American entity, any receipt that they get from that American entity is not going to help them for their Canadian taxes. So in your case, it seems to me that you know, you would want to consider, you know, making an incorporation or a registration of an American entity so that you can deal, because they're really quite separate.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Дякую, Tarase. It was very interesting. Lada Daravich from Plus Toronto. It's interesting to hear about the changes in the disbursement quotas and especially to non-qualified donees. We don't have a lot of partnerships in Ukraine personally with Plus. We leave that to our national executive, but I have worked with charities that have had partnerships with Ukrainian organizations, and so it seems to me like it hasn't really affected sort of the high risk and medium risk. I mean, you always had to have agency agreements in place, so it seems to me like it's just formalizing the lower risk ones, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm actually curious how that change affects individuals, because I know that, and I come at this from my arts background as well, having worked as a performer for many years, and applying for funding or working for companies that are applying for funding to foundations in Canada. Many foundations actually can't give gifts to individuals. Does that affect their ability to support individuals who may be applying to them who would have not otherwise been eligible because they weren't a registered charity or nonprofit?
Okay, fantastic question. And so I got something from, you know, what you had said at the beginning, and you really tied it in well. So it might have sounded like, and I understand everything that I was saying it's not all applying to Ukraine. It's not all applying to, you know, overseas entities. All of this, everything what I said also applies to Canadian organizations. Okay, so everything what I said, that a Canadian organization can, you know, give money to a qualified donee in Canada for projects here in Canada. And now Canadian charities can also work with non-qualified donees. And a non-qualified donee is also an individual. So
that's huge.
Yes,
that's
so
huge.
That is huge, and that's quite important, that it opens it up, that you know, Bogdana's example of a band, or in your example of an artist, that now foundations can work with non-qualified donees, which can be an individual.
That's very exciting. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very insightful presentation. We've met before and we've discussed a few points, but I'm just going to ask an extension of those points and an extension of your presentation, a very lovely presentation and very thought-provoking. Now, my question is relating to our engagement in the science and technology sector and with academic institutions back in India. So I was just interested in and curious to know, with the new provisions that have been put up by Revenue Canada or the Government of Canada, are there any restrictions on the kind of activities which are not permitted for, you know, to be a qualified donee or to allow for charitable donations? And what those restrictions can be?
Okay.
Just before
sure.
we get into that activity. Thank you.
You know, thank you so much for these questions, because you're pulling out all the issues that I didn't say in my presentation, but that are in the written part. So, what are the restrictions? Okay. Well, the main restriction is that the activities have to be charitable. So you have to make sure that they're charitable according to Canadian law, not charitable according to overseas law. So for instance, in Ukraine, certain types of sporting activities and clubs fall under their charitable regime. Not in Canada. In Canada, you can have amateur athletic associations, but let's say a hockey club or a hockey league or something like that, not charitable. And there are organizations, let's say like Right to Play, which are charitable, but it's not directly related to sport. It's related to youth. So you have to make sure that the activity is charitable, and you can't have a mix. You can't have, charitable and non-charitable. It has to be 100% charitable. So that's really the restriction. So if we're talking about, let's say, STEM activities, it's got to fall into education, advancement of education, because that's one of the 4 pillars of charity, as they say. It's got to either fall into advancement of religion, education, relief of poverty, or the catch-all, which is other programs which are beneficial to the community and that the courts in Canada have recognized as being charitable.